Okay, so there are three row operations that produce matrices that represent systems with the same solution set. The three row ops are: first, to interchange two rows; second, to multiply a row by a non-zero number; and then third, multiply a row by a non-zero number and then add that product to any other row. These are the same three operations that we used in the previous section on echelon form. So we're going to go ahead and practice those. So the first one says row 1 interchanged with row 3, when the double arrow says interchange of the two rows. Now you don't have to, but if it helps to write row 1, 2, and 3, you can. Notice the only thing I'm not changing is row 2, so I'm going to go ahead and put row 2 in right now because that's the only one I'm not actually changing at all. Row 1, 3, 1, negative 1, 9 goes in row 3, so I'm going to put that in row 3 right now. And then row 3, which is 1, 2, negative 1, 0, goes up in row 1. And that is row 1 interchanged with row 3. Next is multiply a row by a non-zero number, so I'm going to take negative 1 times row 2 and put it back into row 2. Notice the second thing I see is row 2, so that's the only thing that's changing here, because that's what I'm putting it into. So row 1 and row 3 aren't changed at all, so I'm going to leave those the same. And then I'm just going to basically multiply the entire third row by negative 1. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. 3 times negative 1 is negative 3. And then 3 times negative 1 is negative 3. And so that is multiplying a row by a non-zero number. Now the third one is a little trickier. Multiply a row by a non-zero number and then add that product to any other row. So I have row 1, row 2, and row 3. There's two operations here. I'm going to do this twice so you guys can get the hang of it. The first one is going to be for row 2, and then the second one is going to go into row 3. The only one I'm not changing this time is row 1. So I'm going to go ahead and put row 1 back in because that's not changing. So I'm going to do row 2 in red. So I'm going to do the work right underneath the row operation. So it says row 1, which I'm going to write over here, 1, 2, negative 1, 0. This is row 1. And I'm adding row 2 to it. And row 2 is negative 1, negative 1, 3, and 3. And when I add down, I get 0, 1, 2, and 3. So 0, 1, 2, and 3 go into row 2. So on the next one in green, I'm going to take negative 6 times row 1 and add row 3 to it. So negative 6 times row 1. So that's negative 6 times 1 is negative 6. Negative 6 times 2, I'm just multiplying negative 6 to every single number in the first row. So negative 6, negative 12. Negative times a negative is a positive 6, and then the last one, 0 times 6 is 0. Then I'm just going to put row 3 right underneath, making sure to line everything else nicely. And then I add down. Negative 6 plus 6 is 0. Negative 12 plus 2 is negative 10. 6 minus 2 is 4. And 0 plus 18 is 18. So that gets me 0, negative 10, 4, and 18, and that's going to go into row 3. So that's how you multiply a row by a non-zero number and then add the product to any other row. So our steps to solve the Gauss-Jordan elimination are: first, step 1, to get a 1 in the upper left-hand corner. Now, how do you get a 1? We're going to talk about that in a minute, but it's going to be very similar to what we talked about in the previous section. Step 2, get zeros below the 1. Now we should already have the 1 and that shouldn't change from step 1, but then I'm going to have to get zeros below it. In step 3, you should have a 1 and 2 zeros below it. The next thing we're going to work on is to try to get a 1 in the second row and second column. Step 4. So I already have a 1, a 0, a 0, and a 1 from the step 3, the previous step. But now I'm going to get zeros above and below the 1 in the second column. So going on to the next step, I've got a 1 and a 0 and a 0. And then I've got a 1 in the second column and zeros above and below it. That was from step 4. So the thing that I'm working on now is to get a 1 in the third row, third column. Okay. And then for the last step, I am looking for, I got a 1, a 0, a 0. Then I got a 1 in the second column and zeros above and below it. Then I've got a 1 from step 5, and I'm looking for the zeros above it. Now once I've got it in this reduced row echelon form, the numbers in the fourth column are going to represent the x, the y, and the z solution. So these are the steps in order to get my matrix in reduced row echelon form. Next, we're going to talk about how to get a 1 and how to get a 0. There's two ways you can get a 1. The first way is you can switch two rows that may already have a convenient 1 in the correct position. This almost always happens in the first step. If you try to do this in another step, you'll probably mess up your 1s and your 0s from the previous steps. Okay. Notice when we went to talk about our steps here, step 1, 2, 3. If you choose to do these in a different order, let's say you have a 1 in a convenient spot and you're like, let's see if I can make that stay a 1. It's not going to work. You have to do these steps in the exact right order, and if you don't, then you're going to accidentally mess up the 1s and the 0s that you've already done in previous steps. So you have to follow those steps precisely here. So this first step, when you switch two rows, usually only works in the first step. So notice that we're trying to get a 1 right here in the upper left-hand corner, and I already happen to have a 1 in the third row. So this is simply, if I just take row 1 and interchange it with row 3, I can conveniently get a 1 exactly where I want it by just switching the two rows. It didn't take a lot of effort, and then move row 2 over here. And now I have the 1 exactly where I want it. So that's one method. Usually only works in the first step. The next way we can get a 1 is if we are trying to multiply the row by the reciprocal. Notice I already have a 1 in the upper left-hand corner. I have zeros below it. So the next thing I'm looking for is a 1 in the second row, second column. So to get a 1 there, if I just take the reciprocal of 2, which is 1/2, times that row and put it back into that row. So I'm manipulating row 2, so row 1 and row 3 stay the same. Row 2, we have 0, 1/2 of 2 is 1, 1/2 of 4 is 2, 1/2 of 6 is 3, and now I have the 1 exactly where I want it. So that's another way you can get a 1. To get zeros, I need to use the third row operation, multiply the opposite number by the row with a 1 in it, and then add it back to the row. So I want to get a 0 below the 1. I already have a 1, which is great, okay, but I want to get zeros below it. So I need to get this -2 to become a 0. The way I do that is I take the opposite of -2, which is +2, times the row with a 1 in it. Well, which of the three rows is the row that has the 1 in the position that above or below it? So it looks like row 1 is the row that has the 1 in it. And add it back to row 2, then put that into row 2. Now I can do two operations at the same time. I'm also trying to get this 3 to become a 0. So the opposite of +3 is -3 times the row with a 1 in it. Again, it's still row 1 because the row 1 is the row with the 1 that I'm going to be using, plus row 3, and put that back into row 3. So what is staying the same? well, the only thing that's staying the same this time is row 1. So I'm going to go ahead and put row 1 in. And then I am going to do my work in red and then do my work in green as well off to the side somewhere. So I have 2 times row 1 plus row 2. So I'm going to take row 1 and multiply it by 2. So 1 times 2 is 2, 2 times 2 is 4, negative 1 times 2 is negative 2, and 0 times 2 is 0. Then I'm going to put row 2 right underneath it, and then add down 0. 2 minus 2 is 0, 4 minus 2 is 2, negative 2 plus 6 is 4, and then 0 plus 6 is 6. And that goes in row 2. And then I'm going to do my work off to the side in green. Negative 3 times row 1 plus row 3. So row 1 is going to be multiplied by negative 3. So 1 times negative 3 is negative 3. 2 times negative 3 is negative 6. Negative 1 times negative 3 is positive 3. And 0 times negative 3 is 0. Then I put row 3 right underneath it. When I add down, I get 0. No big surprise there. That's what I was hoping for. Negative 3 minus 1 is 2, and 0 plus 9 is 9. So I have in the bottom row 0, negative 5, 2, and 9. And now I already had the 1 in position, but now I have the zeros below it. So I have now completed the step where I wanted to get zeros above or below, in this case below the 1.